Very warm welcome. It's great to see you here, to welcome you all here in the room and on Zoom. And it's a big turnout, especially as this is post-Cambridge that is exhausted after all marking. So there's an enormous sign of the general interest. And also a warm welcome to the people on Zoom. My name is George van Kooten. I'm a close colleague of Anna Lefteratou, who has done so much to bridge the gap between classics and theology. You are the embodiment of this bridge. And today you will see the official launch of her splendid book, the Homeric Centos, published by Oxford University Press. You've all seen it, or it's even displayed there on the screen. And it shows how Homer and the Bible are interwoven, at least in late antiquity. And we just received the news this very morning, haven't we? That Anna's book has been shortlisted for the London Hellenic Prize. Only 1 out of 5 books across the entire interaction between Hellenism. And so this is a real. Anna's book is tremendously important, as even today there is still the perception that the relation between the Bible and Hellenism is secondary, even though the reconstruction of the textual edition of the Jewish scriptures is heavily reliant on the Greek text of the Septuagint, and even though the entire New Testament has been exclusively written in Greek. The contemporary collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance, is only written in Greek for 4%, so 96% Aramaic and Hebrew. Anna has chosen a very appropriate day to launch her book, her new orthodoxy. As you all are aware, today's date, the 19th of June, is the beginning, I'm looking at Professor Ferguson, the beginning of the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea. That started on the 19th of June, so there might be a hidden message in this event. This event, it started on the 19th of June, lasted till the 25th of August. So I guess we don't have so much time as they had in those days, although we do have an excellent panel that could easily captivate our attention so long. But alas, we are limited to 90 minutes. It is my pleasure to introduce the panel very briefly, and they will speak each for about 15 minutes, followed by a response by Anna for 10 minutes, and then we have some discussion within the panel, and then open the floor to a discussion with the room and Zoom. So first of all, it's Daniel Weiss, just been freshly promoted to a professorship in Jewish philosophy with effect from the 1st of October in the coming academic year. Secondly, Emma Greensmith from St. John's College, Oxford, author of The Resurrection of Homer in Imperial Greek, and also an editor of Writing Homer under Rome, so very much an expert relevant to today's issues. But of course, she did her PhD and postdoc here in Cambridge, so warm welcome back to this other place. And thirdly, Aaron Pelttari from the University of Edinburgh, an expert on Latin poetry of late antiquity, among others on prudentius. So we have a highly skilled panel, and you are all very welcome, and I would like to acknowledge the hospitality that made it possible that we received from the faculty and also from the Cambridge Interfaith program. So the floor is yours, Daniel.
Thank you. So for those, I guess it falls to me to give a actually introduction of saying just the bit of what Dr. Lefteratou's book is about. For those who haven't yet read it, haven't had the pleasure of doing so. But basically, the short version is reusing Homeric lines to re-narrate biblical narratives. And so this is the Homeric Centos, the forms of poetry, telling biblical narratives through the Homeric line, and specifically through direct citations. So taking one line from the Odyssey and then following up by a line from the Iliad and another line from the Odyssey in that order, and reusing them in a different context to tell narratives about Mary, Jesus, etc. And so we'll hear more about some of the specific dynamics. But what's key about Anna's book is that she highlights the way in which the Homeric Centos, these forms of poetry, can and should be understood as a form of biblical interpretation. And by giving close attention to the specific ways in her book, she analyzes the ways in which specific lines from Homer, how they're reused in telling biblical stories, and the way in which the Homeric themes and vocabulary then resonate in new and creative ways in the context of these retellings. She's able to highlight the Centos as contributing new biblical and Christian theological dimensions, not in spite of, but precisely through the use of lines from the Iliad and the Odyssey. And part of her argument, she argues that various previous scholars have tended to place these poems in the category of Homeric literature, which makes sense on one hand, they're drawing on Homer, but some scholars have somewhat neglected the new light they can shed on the biblical text, where she shows that the cross-cultural dimension of the Homeric and the biblical can be properly understood. Okay, not needed. But I'll take it. The way in which this cross-cultural dimension, the Hellenic and the biblical, can be just as properly understood squarely within the category of biblical engagement. And so part of the question she looks at this also is why some previous scholars have been more hesitant to place the Centos into that category of biblical interpretation. And so one aspect I said that she draws upon is this aspect to be concerned about the cross-cultural elements. What does it mean to illustrate characters from the Gospels, for instance, by means of descriptions of actual words that in their original context refer to Odysseus, Penelope, Ajax, or Menelaus? Does this risk contaminating the biblical narratives by words that have a, quote, pagan origin? Could be one question. Or, as she shows through her close analysis, can the Homeric lines that are brought into contact with biblical narrative generate a fruitful synergy? So that one element is this cross-cultural dynamic, bring those together. And one other element that also gets brought up is the question of linguistic dynamics. What's going on by, how can one understand the way in which lines from Homer can even linguistically function to tell narratives from the Bible? Is that even possible? And so to some degree, some scholarship, trends in scholarship have been hesitant to see it that way because they, as Anna described it, she described another scholarly bias, quote, which concerns the revision of the Bible and is as old as Tertullian's and Irenaeus's reservations about Cento poetry, which they associated with misleading interpretation. And so this is again, so in this around the same time, both Tertullian, Irenaeus, also Jerome referred to this pattern of Cento poetry, in part in criticizing groups that they viewed as heretical biblical interpretations, Valentinians, etc., saying that these heretical writers are taking biblical texts out of context and reusing them in problematic ways, like the authors of the Cento poetry do. And so there's this question that, so on the one hand, Jerome writes that the use of using Homeric lines or Virgilian lines in Greek or Latin to retell Christian narratives, he questions, is this as if someone were saying that Virgil or Homer was a Christian? And Jerome uses this negatively. How could someone writing from that context, historical context, not directly connected to Christianity, have any connection to Christian theology and Christian teaching? And how could those words have that connection? But he also expresses concern about it in specifically linguistic terms, talking about people who, writers who do this, either are reusing lines from Homer for biblical purposes, or reusing lines from the biblical text to construct theologies that Jerome doesn't like. He talks about the problem when people, the practice of distorting one's meaning and forcing scripture against its will to their own desires. So this is, he's talking about people using scripture in that way, but in that same linguistic assumption, it could seem as someone could be forcing Homer against Homer's will to talk about biblical narratives. And there's something about this concern about departing from the original intention of the text that raises concern from some patristic writers. For instance, Irenaeus, in a similar context, talking about, again, this is in comparing heretical Christian writers to Canto poetry, talks about them as they disregarded the order and connection of the scriptures, and so far as in them lies, they dismember and destroy the truth by transferring passages and dressing them up anew, and making one thing out of another. They succeed in deluding many through their wicked art in adapting the oracles of the Lord to their opinions. So again, this hesitancy, the patristic hesitancy about the quote misuse of language, especially either whether scriptural or Homeric, seems to also have been tied into scholarly trajectories in which there's then a hesitancy to grant a certain type of scholarly approbation to the cantos and reading them as a form of biblical interpretation. So some of that may be inherited, stemming back all the way to Jerome and Tertullian and Irenaeus up through the present day. And Anna's book then constitutes a sharp challenge to those sorts of assumptions, that there can't be anything fruitful. And she shows very much how there can be fruitful theological interpretation in that way. And the other thing I wanted to bring in, I think that her analysis is really interesting in that the cross-cultural elements, again, of sort of Homeric literature vis-a-vis Christian biblical interpretation, and bringing in as well, I think it could be interesting for further conversation, the way in which if we bring in the text of rabbinic midrash, so from around the same time period, it's 4th or 5th century, and the way in which they are reusing biblical texts in different contexts. I'll give an example in a second. I think putting that alongside the Homeric Centos can also then show a broader range of different cultural contexts in late antiquity, where there can be attitudes towards a reuse of text, creative reuse of text, as having theological legitimacy, and not simply being destructive or inappropriate. So I'll give just one example here, and hopefully the other speakers will also show examples from the Homeric Centos to compare it to, but you can, just from the description we can see, so this is Psalm 139, the first 6 verses, and it's a prayer attributed to David of, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me." So it's this expressive prayer. And just highlight verse 5 that says, "You hem me in behind and before. Achor v'kedem sartani," there, and lay your hand upon me. And now this is in the context, if we look at verse 4 and 6, "Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me." So it seems to be in this context, the hem me in behind and before, in this context here, it looks like it's about God's knowledge of the person uttering the prayer. And one wouldn't look at that verse necessarily, I think most people here. How many people here were thinking of this verse on its own as referring to the opening chapter of Genesis? Anybody? No? Now, let's take a look at what Genesis Rabbah, a text from this 4th, 5th century in the Palestinian context, does. That it, in interpreting it's the verse from the beginning of Genesis, God said, "Let us make man in our image," etc. And then Rabbi Yochanan commenced this discourse by citing Psalm 139:5. So bringing that psalm from its seeming location in the book of Psalms and placing it now next to and in the context of this narrative in Genesis. "You have formed me behind and before." And in giving an interpretation, then in this context, bring it into in the Genesis 1, Rabbi Jeremiah ben Leazar said, "When the Holy One, blessed be He, created Adam, He created him a hermaphrodite. For it is said," and now bringing in a verse from Genesis 5, "Male and female He created them and called their name Adam." So again, this is reading now with this interpretation of creating the first human being as double-faced, the verse from Psalms that's been brought in, form me behind and before, is now that the original human being was formed with a front face and a back face, the behind face and the before face. Explaining so when then the creation of man and woman comes from when the Lord created Adam, he created him double-faced, then he split him and made of him two backs, one back on this side and one back on the other side, as the man and the woman now separated. And then it brings an objection, but isn't it written he took one of his ribs? So it doesn't sound like he took a whole side of a person, took just a rib to make the woman. And then brings in a verse from Exodus saying, mitzalotav means from one of his sides, not one of his ribs. Because we see in the book of Exodus, in describing the setting up of the tabernacle, it says for the second side of the tabernacle, Selah, using the same word. So one can read then the Genesis one, he took one of his Salotav, one of his sides. Now, again, we can see this sounds, I can look at different facial expressions here. Sounds like a creative reading, but what we can see is in some ways, I think, very parallel to the Canto use in terms of it's now bringing in a verse from Psalms. And now, how does the bringing the verse from Psalms into the context of Genesis change the narrative of Genesis and change potentially the reading of the Psalm? And likewise, bringing the verse from Exodus into this context, which again would not appear to be directly connected. But this element, I think Anna's book brings out the way in which now it can illuminate the Midrash in different ways by seeing it parallel to the Cantos and vice versa. And what's interesting here is if there was controversy or debate in antiquity about the reuse of Homeric verses for retelling biblical narratives, there could also be similar concerns as we saw about how that parallels concerns about the reuse of biblical verses in creative ways or ways out of their original context. And the question of how can we understand the theologically committed use of both Homer or the Bible in these ways which seem out of the ordinary? What would it mean to understand those as a type of serious engagement with the biblical texts rather than disrespectful or merely playful? And so we can just, both with the Midrash and I think the Cantos, think about elements of this element of reuse. What does it mean to use texts that originate in one context? And so again, this is not allegorical interpretation, but it's by putting one text from one context into a different context. It can now take on a different type of meaning. And I think Anna's book also highlights the way in which what does it mean that the Homeric texts were able to be used in this late antique cultural context? To what degree does it mean that these texts were understood as culturally ubiquitous, belonging in one sense to all parts of society, and therefore could be drawn upon and reused in these new ways? And to what degree does the concerns raised by someone like Jerome and Irenaeus and Tertullian, if they don't like the biblical text being used in that way, is that because they're treating it as more proprietary and less as an open text? Whereas it might be that the Homeric text is functioned as an open text, a free use text in the same maybe with Creative Commons license, you could say as a. And how does her analysis also relate to elements of authority? If Homer can now function to retell the biblical narrative, does that mean if Homer is available to everyone, does that mean one doesn't necessarily need a specific type of institutional authority to engage with the biblical narrative? How does that cross-cultural element reconfigure elements of authority? And as well as she highlights elements of gender in the book, both that the Homeric Cantos and also the prominent Virgilian Cantos of Proba and Antiquity both have been attributed to female authors. And is there something about this type of use of language that in a Christian theological context that would go more along with people who are less able to be in certain positions of authority? Is there something about and how much does Irenaeus or Jerome's dislike of that use of language go along with the sense that there ought to be a proper authoritative use of scripture in that way, which may in that context then be more confined to male interpreters? So I think it raises this question of gender and also this dynamic of play versus seriousness. I mean, it'd be interesting, Anna could maybe tell us more when she describes this use of Homer to people who haven't heard about it before. How do they respond? Do people think it seems strange, or how can you use Homer in that way? Is that really serious, or is it some type of game? I think her analysis shows us that the dynamics and dichotomies people make today about play versus serious, and what would count as a serious use of text, may stem from various cultural assumptions that were not held by everybody, at least in antiquity. And so I think it can also then raise questions for us today about how we think of play and seriousness in relation to theology and our work more broadly. So I'll stop there, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to actually come from a very different angle to this idea of kind of cross-cultural dynamism and dynamics that Daniel spoke about. And I'm going to come at it from the perspective of text and also my own training and my own work as a classicist who works on the Homeric epic and Homerizing epic side of things. So as George discussed in his introduction, and Daniel said in the first part of his talk, the opening self-definition of Anna's brilliant book, that it is an attempt to contextualize the Homeric Centos, and then this sort of statement in acquisition about what it is, a biblical epic in Homeric hexameter within the cultural milieu of late antiquity, that from the perspective of categorization and compartmentalization, this definition of the Cento as a biblical epic in Homeric hexameter is far from straightforward, and it is a bold intervention. I think it captures the nature of the intervention of this very radical, very quietly radical, but radical rereading of the Centos. Because as Anna herself notes, and this has already been discussed, the textual transmission of the Homeric Centos was for a long time entangled with their early modern reception as either Christian or Homeric poems. And what I want to talk about is how this notion of the either-or has had a long and ongoing impact about ideas of late antique poetic production more broadly, and particularly in the classical field of classical scholarship. As Anna also talks about in the book, and which her book is very much a part of, there's been a real explosion in scholarship on Greek poetry, on all poetry, Greek and Latin, but on Greek poetry in late antiquity. And there's been a real marked feature of classical literary studies since the turn of the 21st century. We're now very far away from what used to be the old scholarly status quo, whereby prose was seen to be the overarchingly dominant form of this era. People like Christian Habicht could write that in the Imperial Greek period, poetry was dead, and Imperial Greek verse, where it was discussed, and it wasn't discussed all that much, with some exceptions, was considered to be culturally insignificant, but also aesthetically lackluster, poor quality, derivative, and dull. One of my favourite kind of cartoonish, but self-cartoonish, he gave us the potential to do this, examples is the author of the Lerb, the 1928 Lerb, who spent time working on this stuff, of some of the major Imperial Greek poets, said that well, these poets obviously dwell on the lower slopes of Parnassus. And he explained that the reason why he was writing this Lerb was because he was getting old and he was really bored because a lot of his friends had died. So that for me really kind of sums up the early 20th century's approach to the verse tradition in Greek. But by contrast, poetry is now rightly seen as having been a very living medium of expression in the late antique Greek world, and epic in particular, poetry in hexameter, as a very powerful medium by which traditional themes and language and ideologies and so forth were renegotiated as the Greek Empire continued on its turbulent collision course and upon the dawning of and then the institutionalization of Christianity. And I've put here, and I want to say, just a selection of the books that have been written about Greek epic since the 21st century. And I've limited myself from what would fit on a PowerPoint to not only my own, but also Anglophone work and volumes and monographs. So this is not including the enormous number of commentaries on individual texts too. So while this is certainly, I mean, it is the most colourful slide on my PowerPoint, and that is both aesthetic and thematic, while this is certainly a really colourful landscape, and it's a really exciting one to be a part of, it is also still a rather bifurcated one. On the one hand, we have work on biblical epic. That is poetry which rewrote books of the Bible or well-known Christian stories into hexameter. And this is a tradition which began in the 4th century, alongside the Jewish tradition, as we've sort of been talking about, with important links there, and reached a real zenith in the 5th century, with the so-called paraphrastic vogue. And on the other hand, we have scholarship which focuses on another really distinctive trend in the poetic output in Greek epic in late antiquity, which is mythological epic. That is a tradition which probably continued uninterrupted throughout the Hellenistic period, of which Apollonius is our major surviving example, but did seem to take on a new or a renewed energy in the imperial Greek world, from the 3rd century onwards, with what seems to be a pointed return to Troy. So we have lots of epics that do the epic cycle again. So we get epics on, you know, the taking of Helen, on Penthesilea, on Memnon, on the actual sack of Troy, and the returns of the Greeks and other saga stories. Now, whilst of course this is a rhetorical categorization of the state of the field, and it's certainly not meant to be a binding one, let alone a caricature, it does highlight a general trend that I will stand by, and I'm part of it. Overall, these two traditions, biblical epic, on the one hand, and mythological epic, on the other, are viewed as parallel, but not symbiotic. They're seen as kind of two lanes in the pool of late antique verse production. And they've consequently tended to attract the attention and expertise of different scholars and produce differently inflected scholarship. And Nonnus is seen on as a Panopolis, is seen as the kind of unique poster boy in the middle because of this is a quote from the Brill Companion, the Janus-like nature of his two surviving works. One, an epic on the exploits of Dionysus, wholly mythological, and one a verse paraphrase of St. John's Gospel. But the scholarship still, I think, on Nonnus is positive. So an example is in the Brill Companion, which is great stuff on Nonnus in so many ways. It has a chapter on Christian themes in the Dionysiaca, another chapter on pagan themes in the paraphrase. So it is trying to do that combining work, but the chapters are still presented as a pair that are parallel. So I think, you know, it's the divide is still there. And this isn't just a kind of, again, although it is a rhetorical move, it's not just a rhetorical move of lamenting the state of a, albeit very vibrant field. It's also important to think about why these traditions have been considered, traditions plural, as sort of parallel but separate. And Daniel already intimated some of this, but I want to put a bit more pressure on it in terms of why I think classicists have tended to, lots more could be said in terms of disciplinary divides and specialisms and so forth. But I think from a more methodological perspective, or in terms of what these poems are seen to be doing, where they do seem to be fundamentally different is in their relationship between, as it were, their quid and their quale, their what and their how, their content and their form. As Daniel already said in his introduction to the Centos, that biblical epics, and that includes Nonnus' paraphrase and so forth, and Eudocia's other surviving poem, the Marston and St. Cyprian, it is Homeric in form, but Christian in content. Whereas the mythological epic, the ones that I talked about that tells of parts of the Trojan saga and so forth, are Homeric in form and Homerizing in content. They stick to Homer's time span, they either do kind of prequels or sequels, or like Dionysus, the god that Homer ignored, but was still in the world, and his kind of, on this theological system, it's still in the mythic flew past in that way. And just to kind of drill down a bit more on this importance of the idea that biblical epic is Homeric in form, but really, really not Homeric in content. The way in which this kind of works out, it seems to work out kind of literarily and aesthetically, is that these epics, these biblical epics, had to employ a form of what is often called non-referential intertextuality. Mouthful, but in a sense that allusions to Homer, an epithet that's normally used for Achilles, used for Jesus, to take an example that I'll be coming back to, is not really an allusion at all. It's the language, it's the textual fabric, but it's completely divorced, and it is meant to be interpreted without the resonances of Achilles is characterized by vengeful rage, or driven by martial prowess and immortal glory based on personal achievements, let alone the sort of almost son of Zeus, son of a nymph, and a world that's deeply embedded in a polytheistic world of immoral gods. None of that had to not just be not relevant, well, not just irrelevant, but non-relevant. And in that way, that the Homeric language, due to the continued prestige of epic, could be used as the kind of the clout to increase the appeal, the aesthetics, and potentially the evangelical message of the Christian poem, because it was completely removed from any ideological connotations of a world, Homeric epic, with which its message was entirely incompatible. Now, of course, the Centos, of which in the Greek tradition, Eudocia's poem is the major surviving witness, have firmly been put in the former category, biblical epic, where form and content put in parallel are safely separated. But as Daniel has said, what Anna's book does, and what I think is one of the things that's most important about it from the perspective of classical studies too, is it confronts this categorization and it tears it open. It has a deeply referential approach to the intertext that we find, to the Homeric language that we find everywhere, in every moment. That's the point. And it also puts it very much, it puts the Centos in the kind of multiverse of late antique Homeric reception, exegesis, and also verse production. And it's this kind of that element I want to spend the last couple of minutes thinking about. The dialogue that it encourages us to open up, the way in which Homer and the Bible are interwoven, yes, but also the Centos are interwoven with other works of great poetic energy, aesthetic excitement from the late antique world, but which seem to be swimming in that completely different lane. And so to kind of show, or to consider why I think this kind of integrative methodology that Anna advocates in her book is so important, and will have kind of ongoing reverberations in the work that we can do. I just want to look very briefly at a case study, what might happen if we compare Eudocia's Centos to a poem which is very close to my own heart, and which is which I swore I'd never do papers on again, but here we go, which is one of the most card-carrying members of the mythological camp. And so the poem in question is the Post-Homerica by someone called Quintus of Smyrna. Now, sorry, I should have put some nice bullet points about what the Post-Homerica is, but you're just going to have to get them from me. I've done this introduction so many times that. So the Post-Homerica is a poem that was composed probably in the 3rd century CE. Otherwise, the provenance and authorship is completely unknown. And it's a 14-book epic, which tells the story of the Trojan War, picking up from the last line of the Iliad, so after the funeral of Hector, and finishing with the storm, the shipwreck of the Greeks and the storm, which kickstarts the beginning of the Odyssey. And its lexicon is enormously Homeric. It's about 80% Homeric words. And in a delayed poem, Quintus, then it's attached to his later manuscripts, the poet, seems to make a claim to be Homer himself. He describes that the muses came to him when he was tending his sheep in the mountains of Smyrna, which is one of Homer's celebrated mythological birthplaces. Now, even from that description, it's quite clear that this is a mythological epic, and the differences with Eudocia in so many other ways are obvious and overwhelming, both in terms of programmatic positioning, and I think Anna will talk a bit more about Eudocia's own programmatic statements, very different, kind of approach to Homeric lexicography. Quintus doesn't kind of quote that much Homer. There aren't many lines of Homer, but he just uses the language in kind of new configurations. And there is nothing ostensibly Christian about Quintus at all. People have looked, but you have to really want to think that this was composed in a Christian world, a Christianizing world. Quintus doesn't say anything about his contemporary context because he's impersonating Homer. And yet, I think Anne's methodology makes the ability to think about them together not only possible, but very provocative. And so what I wanted to do, kind of applying this methodology, I wanted to see what happened if I compared just one aspect of what we find in the Centos to what we find in Quintus, in and against all of these differences. And what what I wanted to do as the case study, to think about their treatment of Homeric heroism. Zoomed in even more through the kind of hero par excellence, Achilles. And through it and through him, crucial concepts like kleos, immortal glory, the afterlife, suffering, and emotion. Now, what also apologies, this is like the slide that has the least intense amount of Greek on it for my next few. But I'm going to whiz through it and we can maybe come back to it later. But yeah, just I couldn't find any smaller passages that I wanted to focus on. One thing that Eudocia and Quintus both do in their various ways, and Anna shows you with Eudocia brilliantly, is they both very much seem to focus on the most rageful dimensions of Achilles, who of course is programmatically associated with the opening word of the Iliad, naming with rage. They don't really emphasize these features, but they seem to exacerbate them. But both poets also put pressure on the consequences of such a knowingly selective, hyperbolized presentation of a consummately composite Homeric character. And the first passage here is a use that Eudocia makes of Achilles in Jesus' own, this passage is in Jesus' own words, when he talks about Judas and his treachery. And here, as Anna talks about very well in her book, Jesus uses Achilles' cruelty to foil Judas and his swift, savage treason. We get a lion simile with Judas, which is the simile used most of Achilles in the Iliad, and Odysseus in the Odyssey, but that's for another day, as a flesh-eating beast, and Jesus is the Lamb of God, the victim. And Jesus also ventriloquizes lines from Priam's monologue in the Iliad, which he speaks from the walls of Troy, just as Achilles is about to kill Hector, and Priam predicts the fall of Troy, that Hector's death will foreshadow. But then, later on in the Centos, the Achilles paradigm re-emerges very differently. This time in the narrator's voice, not Jesus' own. And this is during the passage of the harrowing of hell, where Jesus' battle with Hades mixes a positive model of Achilles as a foil now for Christ, who retaliates forcefully against his opponent. But then we also get a negative, but very different negative Achilles for Hades. And here it's not the kind of savage, bloodthirsty Achilles of the Iliad, but the kind of grumpy, depressive Achilles of the Odyssey, in the Odyssey's own underworld, where during his meeting with Odysseus, Achilles rejects the heroic ideal and sort of manifests literally kind of an embittered, dead hero. Now, Quintus displays similarly literary mixed feelings about Achilles and his role and limitations as a heroic model. And again, I'll whiz through these passages. Quintus does the death of Achilles, which is, incredible. We actually get in fully surviving London poem, Achilles' death that is always around the corner in the Iliad. And during his fight with Apollo, it's a savagery all the way. We get none of the kind of new sort of Menes versus Philotes and self-laceration and deprecation that we find in the Iliadic Achilles. He's a character of great excess. And we get a line simile again to characterize this excess, and also so kind of over emphatic is Achilles in his own Menes, that he actually even ventriloquizes Apollo's own words against him. So Apollo in the first passage towards the end, he says, "Get back, Achilles." Oh no, I've flicked ahead. "Get back, Achilles." And then later on, in the passage, Achilles says, "Anakaziotele, get back, Apollo." So kind of almost performing a sort of hyperbolic cento of a god's own words. But then, in Quintus's version of the afterlife, which is not an underworld at all, we don't get Hades, or anything like that. But in the final book of Quintus's poem, Achilles appears not in the underworld, but to his son Neoptolemus in a dream. And it's one of the most fascinating passages of the poem. He kisses his son, ghosts aren't supposed to do that, we're not supposed to touch. He kisses his son, and here he is sort of bizarrely advocating gentleness, but yet at the very same time, and indeed within the very same line, so kind of this one here, he pivots to anger again. So he tells Neoptolemus to be gentle, but then he says, "But you've got to tell the Greeks and that, remember, sacrifice to me, otherwise I'll be even more angry than I was to Paros." before, i.e. the Iliad over Briseis. And this idea that you can have kind of two, this is a character and a characterization knowingly at odds with itself, and that at oddness is expressed through language. So one of the things that Anna's book shows so much is that the use of heroic parallels and falls is never just an analogy. It's never just Jesus equals Achilles. Well, Jesus definitely doesn't equal Achilles. You know, you can have Jesus with Odysseus on the mast, or the tortured Menanthius, or the ugly beaten Thersites. And even though Quintus, his narrative means that the characters are the characters, they still pivot. We still have this kind of this whirlwind of different associations, and that is enacted through twists and turns and pivots of Homeric language across verses and even within a single verse. So to conclude, Quintus' post-Homerica and Eudocia's Homeric Centos are very different poems, and they give us very different Achilleses. Quintus gives us an actual Achilles in a narrative Sebes, whereas Eudocia gives us a disembodied and reconstructed ragdoll. Quintus uses lines, ideas and themes from Homer, but rarely his actual lines, and Eudocia's disembodied Achilles is reconstructed using every single line of Homeric original. And yet, there are, I think, uncanny or perhaps canny and important similarities between these two poems, both in their quid, the fact that Achilles is there, and in their quale, and in their literary, elusive, and aesthetic technique, if we are bold enough and interested enough to see them. And I think that one of the most brilliant things that Anna's book does is to embolden us and to encourage us to think about these similarities, and indeed these differences, to be engaged to thinking about them at all. And I put this quotation up there from the end of her book, where she draws attention to these possibilities herself, and it's a cue that I would very much be encouraged to take. And the fact that actually, as Anna intimates here, that what Eudocia does is, it is radical. To do biblical epic in that first categorization is a radical intervention. I'm never going to be convinced otherwise. But it doesn't need to be antagonistic or agonistic to Homer, or indeed to biblical exegesis. And this idea of being kind of radical but not agonistic, a different form of being different, is something that I spent a long time thinking about with Quintus, and indeed, I think is a wonderful way to characterize the nature and effect of Anna's intervention in her brilliant book. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to be here today and to celebrate Anna's book. A rich and substantive book on the Homeric Centos is a treat. Anna's book, I might say, set a new standard for work on Eudocia, certainly, and for late antique centos in general in Greek, but also in Latin. It is a pleasure to be here. I want to focus my comments on two themes, which you'll hear some, they're echoes. First thing, the continuity and or transformation embodied in cento poetry. Second theme, the way that a cento perfectly represents how language in general and characters are shaped by pre-existing models. Continuity or transformation and models are the topics that jumped out to me from Anna's book. These are directed towards two broad questions for Anna, perhaps in the first place, but about Eudocia and her centos, but more broadly as well, that I think it'd be worthwhile for all or many of us to think more deeply about than even we have now. First question, how might Eudocia's centos serve as a model for integrating ancient poetry into one's own new world, perhaps new wine into old sealskins, if you can put it that way? Menelaus's sealskins, I hope you've all seen from reading, play a cameo role in the cento as an analog for the human flesh taken on by Christ in the incarnation. Absolutely lovely line. Second question, were there any aspects of the scriptures or of Homer, this question for Anna in the first place, that you expected to find in the scriptural Homeric Centos, but did not find. There's a limited range of material that Eudocia, Patricius, Inicentinus could use. How and why did they select the material that they did? For my own part, I spend most of my time with Latin poetry of late antiquity, which is another reason I'm delighted to be here discussing the Greek poetry that has not received, up to this point in the last decade perhaps, as much attention as it deserves. I was drawn to various comparisons that Anna's already made between the Greek and the Latin traditions, in particular between Eudocia and Centinus by the name of Proba. So Faltonia Betitia Proba was a Roman noblewoman who composed a cento from Virgil's poetry, Eclogues, Georgics, and Aeneid in the 350s or 360s, 70, 80 years before Eudocia. The poem is analogous in many ways to Eudocia's work, except that the change of language and poetic traditions involves an approach that is in many ways radically different. What I want to do is highlight a few of those differences so as to, I think, emphasize Eudocia's innovations, and here I am following in Anna's footsteps. In describing the difference between the Greek and Latin traditions, Anna noted, quote, Homer's currency in the East probably allowed for greater formal and ideological continuity, in contrast in part to Proba in particular. Likewise, in her exposition of the hypothesis of Patricius to his earlier version of the Homeric Centos, Anna noted how, like Eudocia, that author does not propose emulation as a reason for turning to the Homeric text, but rather presents a version of the scriptures that, quote, corresponds to a ritual performance of personal faith. The proem of Proba's cento sets the stage for her poem with an intense evocation of the novelty of her work, the first contrast. I'll avoid some of the most famous lines of Proba's poem, the non-authorial preface to her work, in part because they've been discussed extensively already. Continuity and transformation are front and center in this poem, though, and in the lines. Put the Latin up on the screen, just to say that's there, but there's a translation as well. So lines, Proba writes, phrase, O Father, power eternal of matter and humans, give an easy path and descend to our mind, and you, the High Father's Son, our strength and source from heaven, come and together run the labor begun. We worship you first and renew deserved honors. Now is the new progeny in whom every age has believed. For I remember, unrolling the records of ancient men, that Musaeus sang before all others in your world of what is, what has been, and what is brought soon to arrive. So the entire, all these lines come straight from Virgil. I've highlighted the references for the fragments that I want to draw particular attention to. So Proba invokes God the Father and God the Son while citing Moses as an authority. The cento technique is clear from the first line from line 34, where line 34, sorry, 3 lines up from the bottom, where the child celebrated in Virgil's 4th eclogue is turned nicely into the baby Jesus, the new progeny. There, Proba clearly transforming that Virgilian hypotext. The cento poet's emulative and contrastive persona is developed in the last 3 lines, 35 through 37, where she speaks in the first person and names her memory of ancient men. Moses, as the first of all prophets, suggests a link between the Jewish lawgiver, and Musaeus. Musaeus, the son, usually, but also the father, importantly, of Orpheus, who was identified since Hellenistic times. Musaeus and Moses were identified both Egyptian. This suggests the cultural priority of the Jewish lawgiver as the source then of Orpheus's wisdom, Orpheus being the source of Homer's wisdom, Homer being the source of Virgil's poetry. So you see in Proba an intense ability to rewrite the entire tradition through this single fragment. This is the emulative, contrastive, and transformational approach of Proba's poetry, in opposition, I think, to Eudocia's more integrative approach to cento writing. Proba's authorial stance is also evident in her attention to her own novelty, or to novelty as a theme. You have the new progeny, you have her renewing the deserved honors to the divinity. She remembers the records of ancient men in contrast to the modernity of her own poetry. Musaeus is singing before all others. So Proba is hammering home this theme of her own modernity as she notes the antiquity of her material and of her model in Moses. Line 37 is particularly interesting of the cento. Line 37, the last line there of what is, what has been, and what is brought soon to arrive. As that line from Virgil's Georgics was translated straight from Homer, Iliad 170, pos ede ta anta ta te samana tra te anta. A line that Eudocia also uses in the section of the Homeric Centos on creation. So there you see a kind of further dynamic. Interestingly, line 29 as well is very closely modeled on Homeric formulae, addressing Zeus as the one who rules over gods and mortals. That line of Homer's is reused also in the Homeric Centos, line 93, just before line 97, which makes me wonder if maybe this could be thin evidence of Eudocia's having read Proba. I leave it to someone who's an expert on Eudocia to see if there are any other perhaps clues from that passage leading in such a direction. I'm getting close to the time that I have allotted to me, and I don't want to eat into Anna's time to respond. So I think I'll stick with this passage as passage from Proba as highlighting nicely enough the two main questions that I wanted to focus on, which is how Eudocia's cento might serve as a model for integrating ancient poetry into new worlds, into our own new context even. And second, how the selection of material reveals the author's interests, and how gaps as well in what we find might be meaningful.
Thank you everybody for being present. Thank you very much, faculty member, colleagues, students. up there, the interfaith, everybody from across various disciplines. I'm missing very much Ezra, who was the mind maker. I mean, he's the one who suggested to me, why don't you do a book launch with the interfaith program at Cambridge? And it would be lovely for her to be here. She's not here today, but send many greetings to her. So when I started writing this book, and when I wrote a research proposal for this book back in 2016, I did not even think that it would become a book. It was a random compilation of projects, and I was thinking of working mainly more on Homer than the Bible, but in the process of writing it, I ended up working more on the Bible rather than Homer, which resulted in me having a job here at Divinity, by strange reason. So, in my response to Daniel and the wonderful observations of Emma and Aaron, I have put some thoughts together. So, first of all, everybody talked about Homer, about virgins as a kind of theological sources, as a kind of like cultural hub where everything is coming out. So I have 2 words to say about Homer, a bit more words to say about Cato. But what I wanted to stress to all the respondents here is that the 5th century, so that is the mid-5th century in which this poem has been written, is an exceptional century in Christian history. Christians were the majority. Christians were, after 381, the official religion of the Roman Empire. It will take up to Justinian to hit that and to hammer that into people's brains, but paganism was out of fashion. Of course, pagan ways of education was always quite popular. Of course, there were several pagans or idolaters or Hellenes, as they used to be called from the Christian perspective, still available in the Roman Empire, and probably they stayed there until Clifford Geristos in the 1500s, so they never disappeared, these people. But Christians were the majority, and that goes back to the questions of Daniel. They felt at ease to do whatever they wanted with Homer and even play with the Bible, which would have been something that would not have been allowed in the first 2 centuries of Christian exegesis, and maybe also not after Justinian, when things became a bit more tough. So how Homer can be used in order to discuss or in order to rewrite a kind of a theologically embodied poem? The word theologian that we use these days, and especially in this faculty, comes from the Greek words. That sounds like my big Greek wedding. From the Greek words, that's the etymology, theos and plebo, to speak about God. So it is not a title that is used for people who theologize in the sense that they do dogmatic research or they speak about dogmatic and theological issues, but they just speak about gods. And if you think simply, this is what Homer did. He praised the gods, he praised the humans, and he even knew what the gods are bringing in Olympus, even in their more intimate times. So Homer, above all, he was a divinely inspired poet. Only a poet inspired the muses would have known what actually is happening on the Olympus realm and what happens in their bed chambers. Homer was also a cultural deposit of Greek idea, that is education, wisdom, and identity. So throughout the centuries, and what I mean throughout the centuries is from the Hellenistic time after Alexander the Great, all the way down to Constantine Paleologos, Greeks learned Greek with Homer. It was an important part of the Greek educational system. If you wanted to make it through schooling, you would start with Homer and you would end with Homer in various kinds of combinations and difficulty levels. But this is something people knew. It was something that people had at hand every day. Some more, some less. What is important about Homer in the process of turning Homer into a theologian is what he fell in the hands of the philosophers. So Stoic philosophers and later Platonizing philosophers, Midi-Platonism and Neoplatonism, they thought that Homer was something a bit more. So they thought that in Homer they could even discover not just the person who speaks about gods, but some deep theological, cosmological truths. The way of interpreting Homer, not as what we see there, so not as poetry, but as a kind of theological allegory, was deeply embedded in the Greek philosophical system. And all this kind of attitude towards Homer expanded and exploded by the period we call late antiquity, that is the 3rd to the 6th, 4th, 5th, 10th century. That's where I'm stuck, at least in my dating of this period. So Homer became a theologian, not only in that he could sing about the gods eventually, but in that he could also speak and reveal unrevealed truths about the divine altogether. And eventually, in the way that it has been used, he was both poet and interpreter of poetry, since through his poetry, philosophers could actually do theology. And it is this kind of poetry that the famous Eudocia, a woman who allegedly converted to Christianity to marry the Emperor Theodosius in 420 CE, used to write the biblical story. My second slide is about what is a canto. I'm sure that when you leave this room, all of you will go around and write cantos in Homeric or Virgilian format. And you will go around your friends telling you, do you know what it means? So cantos is a pastiche kind of poetry. They are, as Daniel said, they are lines taken verbatim from one context, brought up another context, irrespective of the meaning of both texts. But in their combination, they create an explosion of new meanings, both with respect to the source text and also with respect to the target text. So the problem when I was writing my book was that the Homeric Centos, which is the title of this manuscript as it has been transmitted down to us, it's actually a biblical poem. And when I was doing my research, eventually I had to do much more with Bible than with Homer. I knew my Homer a bit better than my Bible, but I learned things in the process. So, in contrast to the Virgilian cantos as well, we have another problem. So Homer, at least their Homer, we know whether he existed or not, that's a different topic for classicists, not for within people. He wrote only two epics, that would have been only the Iliad and the Odyssey. When Procobox, for example, set out to write her Virgilian canto, Virgil, he wrote the Aeneid, he wrote the Georgic, he had written epic heroic poetry, he's also written didactic poetry, he also wrote some more lyrical parts, so it was a bit more, there was much more material into that. In order to make sure that you leave this room and you know what canto is, I have compiled some lines from you from Shakespeare's sonnets. So if you want to write a canto, for example, on this very famous pose, the hymn of love that we find in the Corinthians. So though I speak with the kinds of man and of angels, but I have no love. I have become a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. Needless to say that I stood there a couple of hours because I'm not a native speaker of English, and I've never done Shakespeare in my undergraduate or in my school. But going through the sonnets, I thought, how can we best put that together? Do you want to give it a try? Or shall I disclose my version, which has been sanctioned by someone in the audience who knows both English and Jerome here, Mark. So
You didn't take any of my suggestions.
I did take the parsing though, the parsing on the line at the bottom. So it is love that lends me 20,000 times. Love surfeits not, love is all truth, it's gentle. No human kind is more gentle than a gong, nor cherubims, sweet though, but may resemble. Melodious discord, heavenly tune, harsh sounding. Love along with music, the heart's deep soul sound. What humbling. He has suggested healing and I think was better. Mark. So I had to decide. When we have this kind of transcription of one text into another, one of course knows that in Shakespeare's sonnets, there's a lot to be said about love, and especially the Venus and Adonis poem. What does that mean if we put Paul's words into this kind of format? What does it mean for this kind of appropriation of one text? Does this kind of love become much more carnal, much more sexy because we find it in kind of love erotic poetry? Or does it become much more of this kind of divine kind of love that we may want to discover as theologians in Paul's own wording on the top? I will not decide on that now because it's not my field of expertise, but I will continue to the next slide. Our famous poet Eudocia, about whom the full book is, she has written a preface to her poetry where she explains what is it that she wants to do. And it's very good that we actually have this preface. It has not been matched with the text in all the editions, but we do believe that this is probably what it was about. So she says that this is a story of a God-pleasing song that she put together. And Patricius, the predecessor who wrote poetry like that, he put it wisely into a book. But what it is problem with Patricius' book is that it was full of errors. But still, Patricius, he said, did not preach everything fully truthfully, nor did he keep intact the metrical harmony, that means the meter of Homer, nor did he evoke only those verses that Homer was singing, all those the copper-hearted, blameless Homer was telling. And then she says, what did she actually do? She put up the work of Patricius, she rearranged it, she made sure that the meter is smooth, that it's sparse, that it's scant, that everything fits in proper order. And she says something that this is my creation, although I'm a woman. So there's a bit of gender there. This is how she adds the word, not here in the rest of the book. So we see no antagonism with Homer in this kind of preface by Eudocia. And this comes very startling in that both Quintus feels very polemic and antagonistic against Homer. Proba also in her poems, she said that I did my Homer much better, I did my biblical Virgilian canto much better than Virgil. And here in Eudocia, we do not see this kind of antagonistic relationship with the source text from which these lines are taken. We see kind of smooth continuation, as if Proba has always been part of the Bard tradition that starts with Homer, continues with Polonius, with Quintus, and ends in Odes, like 1,000 years of epic history in dactylic hexameters. So what I can just do is to mix up the texts and to take elements from a variety of texts to express new truths. For this thing to happen, you need, of course, to have a specific momentum in history where this kind of cohabitation and interreligious and intercultural dialogue is possible. We have other moments in Greek history where this thing was not possible, was less recommended, like the of Irenaeus, for example. So that would have people who not only protested in the use of Homer back and forwards, but especially and mostly in the use of Homer in a rearranged format. So although ancient audiences could actually read Homer back and forward, adding, deleting, or implementing lines according to what they felt Homer should sound like, this was less the case with the Bible. The Bible throughout late antiquity and also later on was a kind of holy text, holy like Homer the theologian, but holy also in a way that you could not reshuffle things within its structural order. You could not have, for example, a council of the gods first, second, and then Odysseus going on his wrath. You first have to have the council of the gods, and then Odysseus on his wrath or drown, nearly drown. The Bible did not allow for this kind of recombinations, and actually was considered heretical to change the order with which the miracles or the structure of each gospel was written, because it was assumed that this was revealed truth. So not the single iota could be changed. This is what I mean. So when Eudocia comes to discuss topics of heroism that Emma presented so well in her paper, of course they have to deal with Achilles. Achilles was the most handsome, he was the most brave, he was the strongest, and he also happened to be the son of a goddess and a mortal man, so that gave him enough of pedigree to make him probably the best possible model for Jesus, or whatever they may have thought Jesus was as a kind of man and God. And this is the terminology George is using for the man God, of other things. But in addition to this kind of epic models of bravery and of like excellent fighting skills, Christian tradition as well, and this was part of what I was thinking about the book, also brought in some bravery materials. So some different kind of moments. It's just we do not find this in the Gospels. For example, the most powerful moment in Christ, in Jesus' life, is actually his resurrection. It is the greatest feat why the incarnation, full incarnation happened. And the canonical sources discuss this kind of resurrection, they are very brief. So in Matthew 28, we learn that, okay, Mary of the Magdalene, she went to the empty tomb, and there was an angel and Christ was resurrected. In Luke, we learn about the meeting at the Emmaus. And in Acts, which actually is the opening chapter of the book, we say, okay, that he was taken up to the heaven, but in between being taken up to heaven, he spent 40 days speaking with his disciples and friends and making miracles. This most powerful moment in Jesus' life, the fact that he actually has overcome death, was not part of the canonical text. It was hinted at, but it was not explained. If I could go backwards. What I wanted to say is that in Christian Orthodox iconography, this kind of victory over death, although not in the canonical sources, it is vivid in iconography in that he's raising Adam from the dead. So this kind of cavernous space there is the underworld, is the tomb, where Jesus takes with the right hand Adam and he pulls him out in a kind of symbolic resurrection theme. So I have a much more funny image here, which comes from much later. This is Jesus with the cross opening the mouth of Hades, that is the death. And this is the devil, who is actually the cause of death for mankind. And he's getting everybody out. And this is actually the most prominent moment of his bravery. So, and you see here, Jesus looks much more like a knight or something else. Where do we get this material from? Certainly not from Homer. So when Eudocia was rewriting her biblical centers, she also had at her disposition not just Homer for models of bravery, but also apocryphal sources. And these were very popular. They may not have been sanctioned by fathers of the church like Gregor Nazianzus and John Chrysostom. Certainly they were not taught in the Sunday school classes, but they were there and people were reading them. So in one of these apocryphal gospels, and this is the apocryphal gospel of Nicodemus, we have a lovely dialogue between Hades, that is the death, and Satan, which is Satan. So when they hear about the resurrection of Christ, they found themselves in the underworld. And then Satan says to the prince of hell, Satan, prepare, he says, to receive Jesus of Nazareth himself, who boasted that he was the Son of God. And yes, he was a man afraid of death, and said, quotation, my soul is sorrowful even unto death. This is from Matthew. To this prince of hell replied, the prince of hell replied to Satan, who is that so powerful prince and yet a man who is afraid of death? Then Satan goes, why did you express doubt of what I'm saying? The full end of this episode ends with Satan, who remains in the midst and stood confounded and downcast and bound with fetters on his feet. This is how the apocryphal tradition presents the victory of Christ over death. Satan remains there and death stays around with humankind until the second coming. Why I'm saying that is that Eudocia, when she's representing Jesus in the guise of Achilles, winning over his foe, which is Satan, in the underworld sea, she is transposing not just the epic themes like the census, like every epic hero he needs to have an underworld journey, but she's also transposing canonical sources and non-canonical. And these non-canonical sources have also invested in showing Jesus as a kind of brave liberator of hell. The next topic I wanted to bring up is the topic of gender. Is there something in Cantor writing that makes it specifically nice for women to do? I mean, the very word Cantor means pastiche. It means actually a kind of cake, something that's been stitched together, the kind of cut we saw earlier in my slides. Well, yes and no. Cantors have been written mainly by males for the sake of fun. They could have been very provocative, and one of them, like the Cantor Nuptialis, would have been going to be like kind of burlesque revision of Virgil for the sake of fun. Just pick up the most erotic bits you want from Virgil and put them back together to express something. It may have been this kind of cantors that Irenaeus, for example, has had in mind when he was making his criticism about whatever he was making his criticism against Valentinius and the heretics. On the other hand, the cantors we have, the Christian cantors we have with the name of Proba and Eudocia, seems to be on the serious side. And scholarship has also thought, this is middle work, so there must be women doing that. And if it's women doing that, do we find any gender politics into that? Does it speak to women better than others? One of the case studies that I actually wanted to see in my book was the case of Eve. What happens with Eve in this poem if it's indeed written by a woman? So here's Eve from a Latent sarcophagus. She's still sexy enough, but not too sexy like earlier pagan models. So it's this kind of transition of latent art to much more like figural and two-dimensional Byzantine one. And in describing Eve, for example, the foils that are being used from the Homeric text are three. One's Dolon, who is actually a spy of the Trojan camp, and he gets caught in the Greek camp, if I remember very well now. The other one is Clytemnestra, the murderous wife of Agamemnon, who killed him when he came back glorious from his Trojan expedition, together with a concubine and the sacrifice of the first daughter in his back. And then there's another famous mythological person here, Jocasta, who is the mother of Oedipus, who married her son Oedipus without even knowing that he was her son. So this is a kind of like. So this is what Eudocia says at the end about Eve, for example. So yet she Eve with sweet and tender words and with many and deceiving talk. She drove the mind of the man astray so as to remember drink and food immediately. And now she goes from Dolon to Clytemnestra, taking lines from the Clytemnestra characterization. Killing her wanted husband and a wretched song she would become among men, and she will leave horrible fame for the women of her sex, and even if one happens to be prudent, for those who live now and those who will later follow. These lines became proverbial, for there is nothing more dreadful or dangerous than the woman, in a nice misogynistic proverb, who puts her husband, who puts in her mind such peace. Such is the unholy deed that she to contrive. She performed a terrible deed because of her ignorant mind. This last line here, though, does not belong to Clytemnestra anymore, but belongs to this kind of Eudocia, this kind of myth about Oedipus marrying his mother without them knowing. And then it continues the end of this kind of beginning, and the occurrence that brought upon men so many evils, and this is the purpose from Iliad, and many great souls did she, or Achilles, send down to Hades and gave everyone suffering and brought sorrows upon many. I did believe that I found here some kind of slight exoneration of E from the part of a woman poet, in the fact that she may have actually acted unbeknownst to her. So Clytemnestra, of course, that's in as the kind of archetypical evil bad wife. You could have had a worse wife than Clytemnestra. Your other choice in antiquity would have been Helen, but probably would not have been just your wife. So bringing in Epicasta or Eucasta in this kind of story balances between this kind of positive, negative, and like black and white kind of women of quickly. And by alluding also gives responsibility or otherwise. However, and I need to stress that not all female poetry or poetry written by women is actually nice towards women or nice towards Eve. In Probus, for example, Centos, Eve does not get better treatment that she gets in Italian when it's being told that you are the devil, yeah, not diablo. So with this kind of examples, I think I need to leave you and open the floor to questions. And thank everybody, the respondents and me for being here, and George and Iona, who is the organizer of everything here that happens and the classes and everything that exists. And thank you very much.
We have 2 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all the presenters. This is absolutely fantastic, your book launch, and we'll all jump back into your book after this, I'm sure. So one thing that struck me in a passage presented from Eudocia's preface is the presentation of Homer as bronze-gutted, I imagine it's Halkenteros, right? Which is not a Homeric word. Is it that? Or?
Not Halkenteros, is Halkion Hetor.
Okay, all right, so interesting, so even better, so because it points in two directions at once, which is to Homer, but also to the tradition of exegesis that mediates anybody's engagement with Homer at that time. How much of that tradition, that critical tradition, filters into
Of Homer, you mean?
of Homer, yes, that surrounds Homer, that basically mediates how you read that text in that period. How does that filter into the Cento?
I think, if I understood your question correct, is that Eudocia does not only read Homer, she has read the lexica, dictionaries about Homer. She has read the commentaries, some combinations of lines or exclusion of lines, highlight the kinds of Homeric traditions we find in the commentaries. Some kind of clusters of lines, and this was the first thing I came across when I was working, like, let's take all the lines about rivers in the Odyssey and the Iliad, and let's write a digression about the river Jordan. These kind of selections of lines, we find them also in the commentaries. We also find like clusters of similar sounding, so there's a lot of Homeric exegesis of one line, like explain Homer with another passage of Homer, but we find also like similar lines combined with her own text.
Which is something she really has in common with the mythological poets as well.
Yeah.
Like that is what they do so much. They know their Homeric criticism inside out. They've read like Apollonius Sophist, dictionary, and everything.
I wonder if you could say a little more about the cultural place of the Centones, in the sense that, I mean, I'm sure you're absolutely right with the 4th and the 5th century crucial moment. You know, alongside your Centones, you've got people sitting on pillars. You know,
Exactly.
elsewhere. You've also got people like Basil who are saying you should read Homer in this allegorical way. That's very fine. You've got Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus saying, along with other Cappadocians, you should be studying Greek Paideia. And you've still got Jerome and others going, don't do it, don't do Centones. Sandra, where would you place them on that scale of Christianities when we come to associate in the 4th and 5th century?
I do think that the times between Theodosius I and Justinian gave what Gianfranco Agosti claims to be this kind of extreme dialogical phase between Christianity and paganism. We do not have that before, we will not get that later, and it's part of historical circumstances. What happens with Homeric poetry and biblical things like here, in a period where other people were standing on their stelae and as well stellites, is that we have several kinds of voices within Christianity itself. And one did not necessarily, and that's the interesting part of the intercultural dialogue, does not exclude the other. Eudocia herself ended up in a pilgrimage in the Holy Land. She ended up in a monastery there, whether for something she must have done or not have done against her husband, we will never know. But she was a great mentor of holy men, the kind of that were sitting on stelae. On the other hand, for example, though, we have this assumption as historians that we have this kind of ascetic movement in Christianity, and we have these hardcore people who go to the monasteries and they dedicate their lives to repentance and rituals of ascetic ways. But we often forget that in this kind of monasteries, we have the first scriptorium, we have organized libraries, and some of the literature of these monasteries is also written in Homeric language and style, like the Dorotheus in the Dorotheus papyrus. So we do have also literature from this kind of more conservative milieux that is also somehow written in the language of Greek education and that has the cultural pedigree. What one can say is that these kinds of different years of Christianity are addressed to different people, different layers of class, of education, but also different moments of one's life. So if you want an immediate healing for somebody, you will just go to any holy man. Whether you are high class, low class, whether you know your Homer or you don't know. If you know that somebody there is healing people, you will just go straight forward without asking for Homeric examiners. But now, if you want to dedicate something religious to your own cultural group there, to your peers, then Homeric Centos would have been the poetry with one could go ahead with. Is that this one?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thanks to all of you for the wonderful panel. I was wondering, I was struck by the tension between intellectual pride and poetic self-effacement that I see work in this kind of genre. And I struggle to think, which prevails and if either should prevail. In the sense that, on the one hand, and also when you were discussing Proba, claiming that in a sense she's improving on Virgil, I suppose, because she's Christianizing him explicitly. On the one hand, what kind of authority, intellectual authority, do you need to have in order to handle Virgil or Homer and use them in the service of, a Christian message in this case? But at the same time, I also see in this type of exercise some phenomenon of self-mortification, because you are precluding to yourself the opportunity of offering your own words with pride. You have to do with the words of others, even if they are the Homer of Virgil. So how do you navigate this?
I do like this question because I was also asking myself, why Eudocia is not just coming up in her text? Why doesn't she say, look, I'm the empress here? Well, the answer is that she's the empress. So in her famous epigram in the parts of Margaret, for example, we have the epigram by Eudocia, and her name, Eudocia, the empress, has been inscribed later on by a different hand, by the people of the city which she visited, in a kind of honorary attribution to her. I'm not convinced that Eudocia's, and I'm not speaking about everybody, self-effacement is an evidence of humility, rather than an evidence of her being the empress. Everybody should know what an empress should be doing. She's doing. So I think there's a kind of tension. So maybe a noble woman like Proba would have felt the urge, look what I have done, and look what I'm offering here to the emperor, because it offers also her work to Arcadius and to the emperors. This is how you should be reading classical epic verse these days, only through Christian lens. But maybe what makes down faces me, Eudocia, is the fact that she is the empress. I have not come to a solution yet.
And can I just come in there, because obviously that's very relevant as well for like poets like Winters who are so sort of powerfully anonymous. And I mean, I think in some ways, I mean, again, obviously, Eudocia, I take your point that she doesn't need to say who she is, because everybody knows. But I think more broadly, I mean, this surely also connected, just thinking all the way back to like, what Patricia Rosenberg said about the Anacreontea, that, yes, they, and I think she puts it really well, there's something actually, in terms of aggrandizement, more powerful even than the ego, which is tradition. So kind of, I guess, Eudocia kind of speaking as the Bible, that's even more grand than saying, this is me, in some way. So it's the kind of the ego that can come through absorbing oneself into someone like Homer or Anacreon or Genesis and the New Testament. So the same way like Nonnus in the paraphrase doesn't have a programmatic.
Until the last lines when he says ego, and you're not quite sure if he's John.
He's John, yeah,
Yes, and
yeah.
that's the most aggrandizing thing
Exactly.
to possibly say, yeah.
So Hans, question for the students. You have just been marking your marvelous work and we are very impressed. So any questions? Please do raise any issues, how you perceive it.
Alex.
Great.
Thank you so much. I was really struck by the Jocasta parallel that Eudocia introduces, and to me, it feels like that introduces a very tragic element to it, where there's this idea of fate as something unavoidable. How does that figure in the rest of the text? So how does she deal with Homer's ideas about fate?
The problem for the Christian exegete would have been to have Eve acting either as a form of the devil, so she would have been exonerated, or whether she was fully aware of what was happening on the spot. So I think the idea of the tragic irony that is part of the pagan and tragic universe. So I'm doing things and I'm just dragging on me some kind of punishment by God, although I actually do not even know what I have done. It's very different from what we have in the Christian world, where you probably have been punished for something you have done, even if this is the original sin, the Augustinian way. So there must have been something back there that has happened. So there is an element of this kind of tragic irony, but in this case with the Jocasta, it plays much more with kind of more nice exegetical approaches to Eve, that she must have been acting as a tool of the devil, so probably she was not fully conscious. Of course, Tertullian, whom you know very well, and you study him, he was not of this kind of cut.
Well, that's splendid. I don't want to end the discussion, but I suggest we go over to the drinks and continue our discussions there. Yeah.
After this thing and after the drinks, we have put some drinks at the Granta, 6 to 7, and at 7 o'clock there's a table reserved at the Thai restaurant Salaton for some people, up to 10, but I'm sure they have more space on a Wednesday evening when everybody else is going to Mabel's. So, and you will just have to come here and listen to Eudocia and Homer. So there is a table reserved for those who want to come with us for dinner.
That's very kind. That's marvelous. Here, drink first. And it was a marvelous afternoon to get some insights in major developments in the study of Christianity and late antiquity. And as a Dutchman, I'm impressed that that the Greeks know their Homer so well, the Brits did Shakespeare, the Italians their Dante, and even the Germans don't know their Goethe so well. This is devastating. Yeah. So thank you so much for all contributions for joining us. And thank you.